Okay, welcome everybody to today's colloquium talk. And our speaker is Kees van Deemter, who leads the Natural Language Processing Group at our department. Kees has led a number of projects in the natural language generation domain, both in industry and in academia. He was at Philips Research from 1984 till 1996. And in academia, he was at the University of Brighton and at the University of Aberdeen before. He worked with linguists, psychologists, and logicians. He has published widely on theoretical issues in his field, including 2 monographs, one of them from Oxford University Press in 2010, called Not Exactly, in Praise of Vagueness, and another from MIT Press in 2016, Computational Models of Referring, a Study in Cognitive Science. So we're very happy about the talk called Linking Linguistics and Computation from Reference to Quantification. Kees, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Albert, for your nice introduction. Let's start right away. Here's the plan of the talk. First, a few introductory remarks about what natural language generation is. And then 2 examples of a particular take on that enterprise. One of them focuses on referring expressions, the other on quantification, both in natural language. And then, of course, there will be some concluding remarks. So what is natural language generation? I'll keep this very brief for present purposes. It's about computer programs that take more or less anything as input, and particularly anything that's not text, and that output text. Here's a currently popular focus of attention in NLG, natural language generation, namely from photos. Okay, so here's a picture and here's an automatically generated caption to the picture. A man holding a tennis racket on a tennis court. Okay, that's a while ago already, and systems have improved since. So that's an example of a fairly hot application. We have growing numbers of people working in the area, fast growing numbers of publications, rapidly improving performance. For example, when you compare the generated text to texts that are written by people. In this case, for example, captions written by people. And then finally, there are the beginnings of commercial success. All the big tech companies now do some NLG, and there are a number of dedicated companies that focus exclusively on NLG. For example, Area in Aberdeen, who employ more than 50 people at the moment. Now, that's a success story, if you like. Nonetheless, NLG at the moment has important limitations. And I'm not the first to point out some of them. So here's a recent paper in 2018, which looked at a very simple class of NLG systems that had actually as their input simple logic-like formulas, very extremely simple formulas. And then you can, of course, check the output and see what it does with them. And these people observed that they make all possible errors rather frequently. So sometimes completely unwarranted information gets added. So things are said that are absolutely untrue. Sometimes crucial information is simply omitted for no obvious reason. And sometimes the facts are just simply distorted. So these are neural NLG systems and some of their well-publicized flaws. You may be familiar with the term hallucination because it has more ability than just NLG. Now, of course, these errors compromise any serious practical application of NLG. Today, I want to focus differently. I want to focus more on theoretical limitations. Recently at an event, I asked about what I call the theoretical dividend of my subject. I asked the question that you see there in blue. So suppose a linguist or a psycholinguist or a logician might ask you, from all those years that we're now doing deep learning based, let's say neural NLG, what have we learned? What have you learned about language and communication? Can you name me a paper that I should read? And the answers were absolutely underwhelming. That was my point, that was my expectation when I asked the question. There seems to be rather little about language and about communication that we've so far learned from these approaches. Of course, we have learned a lot about machine learning. Why all these different limitations? Now, one observation that can be made is that deep learning typically focuses on patterns within text, sometimes completely overlooking the world outside. Furthermore, data sets are often biased. So here's an interesting example that was recently pointed out. Visual recognition software that recognizes animal species, as you have to do, for example, when you want to generate a caption to a photograph, turned out to rely more on the vegetation in the background than on the actual animal, right? So all kinds of statistical errors are creeping in. What you can learn from that is, of course, when you compare with the social sciences, they too work from data, just like we are used to doing, but they seem to have a more grown-up attitude about data, where they're very careful about avoiding confounding variables. Furthermore, the way in which we assess our progress seems to be flawed. A lot of our metrics focus on superficial counts, counts of words, counts of pairs of words, counts of, in other words, n-grams. So here's a simple example. Sentence A and sentence B. They're exactly the same, but one says there is strong evidence for something and the other says there's no evidence for something. Just one word of difference. Now, if the sentence is short, that may be a substantial difference, but of course the sentence can be arbitrarily long, right? On the dots, you can fill in things of, 1 word, 100 words, whatever you like. So that means that the severity of the error as a proportion of the total number of words, because that's how these metrics work, gets arbitrarily small. So unsurprisingly, metrics that work like this have found to correlate very badly with human judgments. Yet, we rely on them when we say this system is better than that system. How can we do better? I think there are 4 things we can do. One is develop corpora that do not just contain text, but text and the data that is described by the text. 2, ensure that the corpora are carefully balanced. Don't just take a chunk of newspaper text, but think carefully about how the text is composed. Third, develop evaluation metrics that are not as superficial as the blue metric that I was just talking about. Develop metrics that look at meaning. And fourth, focus on the things that are hard. Focus on the things that we can't do, which is mainly structural, broadly speaking, logical aspects of text. Word like not, words like all. So those are some very programmatic introductory remarks. And what I want to do is give 2 examples. One example is theories, models of referring, of when people refer to an item. I've worked on that for a long time. Now, more recently, we've started work here in Utrecht on models of quantifying what happens when people use language to quantify over objects. So the first topic I'm trying to keep rather brief. So that's computational models of referring. These pieces of software are known as referring expressions generation. So to refer is to identify an entity for a reader. So to talk about something or someone so that the reader knows what you're talking about. Now, there are lots of algorithms in that area. And in Aberdeen, we started asking, how well do these algorithms actually do? So that was the tuna experiment that we did quite a while ago. What we did is we showed people visual scenes in which we carefully manipulated their properties, their shape, their color, their size, their orientation, making it very balanced, right? So, for example, there was always, right, there was an equal number of scenes in which just the shape was enough to identify an object, as there were scenes that where color was solely enough to identify the object, and size and orientation. Equally for combinations of 2 or 3 of these attributes. Very balanced, as one is used to in the social sciences. Here you see one of those trials that was shown to the subject. So the subject had to produce an utterance that identifies the object in the window. So they might say something like, you know, the large gray desk that is facing left or something like that. So that would be one little item in our data text corpus. And it's a data text corpus because that utterance is linked with this precise picture. We then gave, of course, algorithms the exact same input as subjects and compared what the algorithms did with what the people had done. Counting semantic content only. Right? We don't want superficial metrics, we want semantic metrics. So here's how that is usually done. Of course, there were a number of metrics that were used, but this one is used most often. You simply compare, let's say, your corpus in a particular point to describe a particular desk in a particular situation. Use 4 attributes, A, B, C, and D. Your algorithm produces a referring expression that uses B, C, D, and E, right? And then there's a metric for computing the overlap, right? And in this case, it tells you that the two have a similarity of, 0.75. The details, of course, don't matter particularly, but what matters is that you look at the information expressed and not the precise words in which they are expressed. So red or reddish, right? Or, it doesn't matter. We started, of course, testing the classic algorithms in this area. We initiated the first international shared task evaluation campaign in NLG, focusing on reference. So that was the first time this was done in our area. And I'll, instead of summarizing the results, let me briefly sketch what happened next. So we started working with psycholinguists, looking at more interesting aspects of language. So we asked the psycholinguist, what are the things that you don't know? What do your models do? How might we improve on them? So as a fruit of that collaboration, we developed models that say how properties of your referring expression differ as a function of the domain size. You can imagine, the larger the domain, perhaps the more you have to say. The role of things like the discriminatory power of attributes, right? If only very few objects are red and your object is red, does that make it more likely that you use the property? When do you overspecify a referent? In other words, when you've logically said enough, under what circumstances do you want to say more? Very often is the answer, but of course, the model makes this precise. How do languages vary? That's a relatively new subject for us. How do speakers vary? We've looked at that a lot. A nice result of that work is the paper that you see there at the bottom. Details don't matter at the moment. What we're very proud of is that this is the top psychological journal, and it publishes our algorithm. We thought that was rather cool. So that line of work was summarized, or at least a large part of it, in my book, the second book that Albert mentioned. It's freely downloadable now. Now on to the main topic, the thing that we just started working on, and that is therefore more at the forefront of our minds. Quantification. So the method that I've been talking to you about so far, is it specific to referring? Or are there other language phenomena that you can apply it to? And we decided to look, right? We want to look at the hard things. We decided to look at quantification. And this is joint work with my student, Guan-Yi Chen, who's a CSC student here at Utrecht University, PhD student. So what is quantification? Most of you know very well what I'm talking about. I start with some examples. All A's are B's, no A's are B's, etc., right? All of these are neatly expressible in something like first order logic, for example. But equally, there are ones that aren't expressible in that way, such as most, few, etc. A dominant view, a very useful view of quantification is to think of a quantifier as expressing a quantitative relation between two sets, as expressible in a Venn or Euler diagram. So on the left at the bottom, for example, you see all the A's and all the B's, right? And if that area that is made blue is empty, then all A's are B's, right? So generally, what a quantifier does is express quantitative properties of these diagrams, possibly comparing two of these regions, for example. This topic, of course, has a very long history, starting with Aristotle, as far as we know. It became a topic in mathematical logic around 1957. It took a while for that paper, which is now famous, to get noticed. Then people students of language took it up, starting from Montague and here in the Netherlands, people like Jon van Benten. And more recently, people in psychology and, of course, computational linguistics have started to get interested. So what can we do in this area? Well, given that there's so much work done already by, for example, logicians. Logicians start from key assumptions, like these are the important quantifiers. But which quantifiers are actually used in ordinary language? And by the way, what do they really mean? And you see this coming. We want to study these questions in the way that I was talking about 5 minutes ago, when I talked about the tuna experiments. Are we the first to do this? Not entirely. Some people have done experiments where they try to figure out whether in a sentence like this, da-da-da of the candies are green, how do you choose, how does the speaker choose between some or many or other quantifiers? And these are nice models, but we wanted to go beyond them, because if the sentence alone is already given, right, where you only have to choose between these two quantifiers, that's a bit boring. You could choose others than these two, or you could choose to make an entirely different sentence. What's more, we wanted to know how quantifiers might be used to perform a real task, if you want to get something done. So we coined the term quantified descriptions, which is really like a set of quantified expressions, so possibly more than one. So here you see two very simple scenes. We asked subjects, speakers, we asked them to describe a scene like the one at the top there in such a way that a reader would be able to reconstruct the scene. Reconstruct, that is, modulo location, right? We don't care where the objects are, just, that there are two blue squares, etc. Each scene contained a fixed number of objects, and we varied over different experiments, we varied that number. So we looked at n is 4, 9, and 20. And we harvested a large number of quantified descriptions. So here you see some concrete examples. If we had more time, I would give you a little assignment so that you could get your hands dirty, get a feeling for the problem. But here you see some examples. At the top, we got expressions like half of the objects are blue squares, the other half are red objects. There's only one circle. That's correct, and it's enough, isn't it? Now, if you make the scene larger, as in the one at the bottom, it becomes much, much harder to be complete. And of course, if you look at n is 20 objects, this is harder even. What did we find? First of all, we found some rather unexpected quantifiers, like quantifiers that aren't binary but ternary, like half of the A's are B's, the other half are C. Also higher order quantifiers, like all possible combinations occur, right? If there are only 4 and you have 4 types of objects, that can be a very efficient way to describe the situation. And indeed, many of our subjects did. Now, before we went to actual algorithm construction, we also performed some classic hypothesis testing. For example, we expressed that in larger domain, we were going to find more logically incomplete descriptions. We also expected the description length to increase with domain size. We expected the number of vague quantifiers to increase with domain size. Those are the most important hypotheses for the moment. So let we look at how they panned out. The first of these hypotheses was neatly confirmed, but interestingly, the second was not. It turns out that when you increase the domain size, people are not going to be more elaborate. Instead of that, they're going to be less precise. And indeed, so the explanation for that can be found in our confirmation of the third experiment, because what they do is when the domain gets larger, people use more vague quantifiers. And of course, when you do that, you're no longer really pinning down exactly what situation you describe. Now, let me sketch very broadly how the algorithms that we looked at work. So suppose the target is as depicted at the top. So that can be summarized as there are 2 blue squares, 0 red squares, 2 blue circles, 0 red circles, right? So what the algorithm starts out doing is mapping out all the logical possibilities, right? So everything might be a blue square, or there might be 3 blue squares, and right? There's a finite number of possibilities for each n, right? So if n is 4, it's somewhere in the 30s. It's a finite list. Then, based on the corpus, we made guesses about what quantifiers might mean. For example, we guessed that all A's are B's means set inclusion plus the requirement that A is not empty. Were we right about that? We're not absolutely sure, but we're going to see how things pan out. Now, if you think in those terms, right? So the idea here is to look at this set of all logically possible scenes and say more and more so that more and more of these possible scenes fall by the wayside. And I'll give you an example very soon. So here it is. Suppose that is our target scene. And suppose we say all objects are blue, right? Then that removes all possible situations except the ones that you see here. So there might be, for example, 4 blue squares and 0 blue circles, or 3, 1, 2, 2, 1, 3, 1, 0, 4. That's all, right? Nothing is red. If you then happen to select, luckily, half the objects are circles, right? Then you can easily see that only the option in the middle is left, the 2 option, right? That's the only balanced one. So if your algorithm somehow manages to find these 2 descriptions, then you're done. So what the algorithm needs to do is search in the space of all possible quantified expressions to make good choices about what to say next. Lots of options suggest themselves. For example, you could have a greedy approach where you always choose the quantifier expression that removes most scenes. Another approach, the incremental approach, uses always the same order of quantifiers, always looks at, is this going to be removed any scenes? Is this going to be to remove any scenes? I don't have time to really look at the pseudocode of the algorithm, but I think the general idea should be clear at this point. Here you see some examples of human produced descriptions versus algorithmically produced ones. So the incremental one and the greedy one, and you start to see what wealth of variations are possible. And of course, we did a primary evaluation using human judges. So we judged these algorithms. We ran the algorithms not just with the sizes, the domain sizes in the corpus, but also with 2 new domain sizes. Otherwise, it's a little bit as if you're testing on your training corpus, not quite, but almost. And we asked our judges, 4 judges, to rate the description on naturalness, informativity, and correctness. And of course, we expected human-generated utterance to be particularly natural, but the algorithmic description should be very good at informativity and correctness, because the algorithm is constructed to always produce correct and complete descriptions. And here you see the outcomes, which are rather surprising for us, because the greedy algorithm did surprisingly well on naturalness. People didn't do better on naturalness than this algorithm. Conversely, the people beat both algorithms in terms of correctness and informativity, as judged by these human judges, which surprises us because provably, in some sense, this is not the case. So obviously, the judges used correctness and completeness, at least to an extent. Right. So in future, we want to look at new metrics and different reader experiments. They're actually ongoing at the moment. And we want to look at more naturalistic settings, because the simple geometric images that we're looking at the moment are, of course, rather simplistic, if you like. Here you see some preliminary publications that we have at the moment, and here are then finally some take-home message about this approach as a whole. As we've seen, NLG is starting to enjoy some successes. At the same time, many people are starting to see that these models don't offer a lot of theoretical dividend. Now, of course, one route is to bet on neural models, acknowledge their weaknesses, but work on them. Make neural models more explainable. And that's a completely bona fide approach, of course. Today, I focused on a possible different route. That is, use methods that have a potential to really link with existing work in linguistics and logic. I think we've demonstrated that with reference, and we're working on it with quantification. So focus on, furthermore, on phenomena that neural approaches or current approaches in general have difficulty with, such as quantification. Do this by developing data text corpora and new evaluation methods, and fit in machine learning where it works. So thank you.
Okay, so let's have a round of applause for our speaker first. Okay, for questions now, I can take questions in the chat as well as by raising your hand. And I'd like to open the floor with a question of my own, if you want. Kees, when you mentioned the neural models, you demanded explainability from them, and also pointed out to their weakness of quantification. And earlier you asked the question, okay, all kinds of deep learning research, what did it teach us about natural language generation? So what are the basic approaches that we need to look at? But I feel like we're running into the problems that the early PDP researchers are also running into. At the time, when they were working on language, the generative grammarians, the Chomsky school, they were positing systems with rules and grammars, and they were very powerful. They were able to generate meaningful sentences, all kinds of stuff. But the connectionist models, the people were limited by the data-driven approaches, and they were very poor in generation. So they were only able to refute the thesis of these generative grammarians by some simple examples, like showing the U-shaped curve of past tense learning is able to be replicated with neural networks as well. So you don't have to have rules. But the problem was there are no multimodal anchors to experience in these models, and they cannot use the world as its own model, and they fall short on semantics, right? So in the tuna example you showed, the neural networks cannot conceptualize all possibilities. They don't have testing and counting, testing and discarding kind of mechanisms inside. They're not built into neural networks yet. So, they're a little bit more complicated, but I still feel that we were lacking a lot of powerful symbol manipulation. I wanted to ask you, what is your take on this? I mean, what could be the solution there?
Right. I certainly don't have a full answer to your questions, but let me point out a few things. So one little thing is neural models about reference are actually much more successful than for tasks such as quantification. So since a few years, there are deep learning models of referring, and they do better than other models, than rule-based models. Okay. So I certainly don't want to get across the impression that I'm against neural models in general. So a second illustration of that point is I focused on the rule-based core of the approach, but there are actually two places where we are going to look at machine learning and possibly neural approaches. So one is finding the meaning of individual quantifiers. So we posited the meaning for all, as I write, but there are actually existing approaches which learn the meaning of quantifiers, and we can splice them into our overall setup so that we have a properly learned quantifier meaning. And the second one is I stopped with my algorithm where the algorithm produces logical forms. Where is the English? Well, that is an additional step, right? You have to go from these quantified statements, which look like logic, to actual English sentences. And that, again, is a step that where neural approaches are very well placed to do that. And finally, my question was not so much what did neural approaches teach us about NLG? They taught us a lot about NLG, I suppose. My question was, what do they teach us about language, right? About referring, about quantification. What do you have to tell a linguist, a logician? And the answer to that seems to be very little. Whereas with approaches of the kind that we've been talking about today, that chance is, I think, a lot better.
Thank you very much. Jelle is asking a question. Jelle, would you prefer me to ask it, or would you like to just open your camera and ask the question yourself so that we can see you? Okay.
So you showed this. You showed this table on how the greedy algorithm actually performed just as well as humans in terms of the naturalness of their description. And I was curious because do you think there's a relation between these scenes being abstract and how natural the description is for humans? Because I would say that personally, if I had to describe an abstract scene, I would have trouble in doing this in a natural way because it is an abstract scene, as it were.
Yeah, I see what you're saying. The fiercest form of your criticism is this is completely an unnatural task. It doesn't tell us anything about how people really use language. Still, right, practically speaking, the judges were quite in agreement with each other about the naturalness of about their natural judgments. So presumably there is something there. I think the only really good response to what you're saying is to move on to more realistic scenes, right? So the next step would be to go to tuna-like scenes of the kind that I showed you, these desks, etc., which are still very stylized. And then after that, we can look at, for example, pictures of people, and right, as we have done with reference, by the way, right, move up towards more realistic scenes, also larger scenes, by the way. And then we'll see.
All right, thank you. I'd be very curious to know the results, actually.
Well, you know, these things have also been done about reference. So your question could be asked about that field, right? Is it generally true that when you have a very unnatural synthetic scene, that the descriptions of that scene are judged to be less natural? I don't think that is what we have seen.
I think, Casey, maybe you have shown us in another presentation this scene where a small triangle was going around following a little circle, and people were just attributing human attributes to these simple geometric shapes. Like, yeah, the triangle is following the circle. If I remember correctly, I think we're very good in attributing some natural order to even simple geometric things.
I don't think that would be, but it sounds very reasonable.
Okay, Alexander has a question. I guess you would then go into language that is natural depending on the context it is used in.
Yeah, I guess mainly replying to Jelle's question, I guess then you would have a very difficult situation as well. For example, in some contexts, the language that I use to convey a message is very different to other contexts when I want to have the same message in my language. But I guess that makes it way more difficult than the things we are, than Kees is trying to do now, I think.
Maybe I should also emphasize that this is only one type of experiment that we're doing, right? And so experiments in which you ask people about things like naturalness, of course, they can be debatable, right? What does natural mean in the first place? Okay? So there are two additional kinds of experiments that we're plotting, and in one case, we're doing it as we speak. So the one that we're doing at the moment is we give the descriptions to human hearers. And then we ask the hearers, can you reconstruct the scene? And then we compute how well they're able to reconstruct, right? So that completely evades difficult words like natural, right? And you can then compute success, right? So that's a very interesting kind of evaluation. And we're beginning to see that the results are quite similar to what we've seen with the earlier evaluation. And the second one is, of course, the approach that's more or less standard in our field, where you use metrics, right? Similarity metrics. Like here you have a corpus. This is what people do. success means being as close to that as possible. So we want to do that, but before we actually start, we need to really think about the cleverness of the metrics, because what does similar mean? Every and all, are they similar or not, right? Are they identical or completely different? So let's not focus too much on the naturalness property.
Okay. If there are any other questions, maybe one last question from the audience. I can see.
Maartje?
Yes, Maartje?
Yes. Thank you for the presentation. For me, it was a bit difficult to follow because it's quite outside of my or my comfort zone. But it did remind me of the research that Stephanie Telex's group was doing at Brown University with human-robot interaction, where they they basically observed how people would describe the location of an object. So they also had tables with like red balls and other kind of objects on the table, and they were observing what language participants were using to describe the location of that red ball to the robot, and then also did studies to make the robot understand that human language. And I was wondering whether that would be relevant for you, or how does it relate to your research?
Yeah. It clearly relates to it. So I mentioned to you the first shared task evaluation campaign, which was done along the lines of tuna. One follow-up of tuna, because there were a number of follow-ups, is called the Give Challenge. And what that did was so people had to submit algorithms that could guide a person through a maze, right? So what they had to do, the crucial thing there was always describing locations, like go to the plant on your right and go into the corridor right behind it and then push the button on the left or something like that, right? So this work has also focused on descriptions of locations, and there's a whole tradition of measuring success. For example, in terms of the time that it takes a player to actually get to the location, and also the distance that it takes them to get there, and lots of other parameters. Yeah. So that sounds, I didn't know this particular work. I'll get back to you later about the name, etc. But it sounds very much, well, at least compatible with that direction.
Okay, I'll be happy to share that with you. And I also know that she has like a whole army of students, so maybe you could even pose a collaboration.
Sounds good.
Okay, you're welcome.
Thank you very much. So one final round of applause for our speaker today. Thank you, Kees.
Thank you all for your questions and for your patience.
Okay, thank you very much, everybody, for joining us today, and see you next week.
Bye.